After her commanding officer unceremoniously disappears, Staff Sergeant Kira Blackwood becomes the next to investigate a lost scientific research vessel in a dimension of ungodly creatures and salacious interdimensional demons who seek out the flesh for their nefarious pleasures and nefarious desires for an influx of mind, soul, and body. Kira is shocked when the entities ensnare all of her squad mates in their psychic web, and learns that the creatures are utilizing the facility as a conduit to invade Earth. She sacrifices herself by setting off a nuclear device that destroys the place and closes the interdimensional portal, saving mankind and rejecting the entity's tempting offer of salvation through enslavement. The transport shivered violently as it sliced through dimensions, and Staff Sergeant Kira Blackwood's stomach dropped and her head spun as reality shivered into a new configuration around her. She peered out through the reinforced window and saw that the familiar blue of Earth's sky, the sky that she saw vanish beneath them half an hour ago, was tapering off into something that was almost painful to directly look at. The color had no name for it, was not to be impulsated, purple-black, reaching out towards their vessel with hungry tendrils. 30 seconds to the drop zone, the captain's voice came through the intercom, and even his normally unwavering voice was tinged with fear. None of us spoke of the fate of the last 3 expeditions. Nobody had to. The bunk beds that had been empty back in the barracks said it all. Kira rechambered the round in her sidearm for the 5th time in as many minutes. The altered pulse roared with pent-up energy as its unique ammo flowed and pulsed according to the beings that they would potentially might encounter. As if there was any question, they always ended the same, every mission to Dimension 10-7, the brass's euphemism for the horrifying world. Contact with hostiles, heavy casualties. The handful of survivors who did make it back always seemed different afterward. The soldier next to her, PFC Marcus Chen, clenched his rifle with such force that his knuckles had turned white. He couldn't be older than 19, straight out of basic, and Kira found herself wondering what kind of dire need could possibly have required sending children into a place like this. She had fought in the front lines of the conventional theaters of warfare for 8 years, and had witnessed more than her fair share of death and wanton destruction. But there was no preparing her for what she saw through the dimensional veil. "Listen up," she said, her voice slicing through the nervous chatter of the 12-person squad. "Remember your training. They feed off of fear and chaos and isolation. Stay as one, stay concentrated, and have faith in your equipment. The neural dampeners should shield you from the worst of their psychic blasts, but also keep your guard up. If you hear voices that aren't from your comms, if you see things that aren't right, you report it immediately. No heroics. None of that investigating strange sounds on your own. We go in, we accomplish the mission, and we come home, period." The ship jolted harshly, and Kira's initial sight of the nightmare world flashed past the end of the viewport. It was a world incapable of physics or sanity. Twisted spires of what could have been buildings jutted from ground that appeared to draw breath, heaving and thrumming with veins of pues and sickly light. The sky was raining something not quite water, each drop making indentations in the dirt. Where it landed, bar down the steps, he saw shapes that hurt to behold directly, that twisted and writhed in ways that should not have been. "Oh, holy shit," someone murmured, and Kira couldn't have blamed them. Even after 3 prior trips to this place, the sight made her flesh crawl. The mission briefing was characteristically nebulous. A research station was built on one of the more stable areas of it, and the entities were studied, as well as their possible use for the military on Earth. The previous day had marked 6 days since contact had been lost, shortly before a regular report was due from the facility. The satellite footage indicated that the complex remained standing, but thermal scans had shown no signs of life. Their task was simple in theory: an investigation, salvage any survivors, and recover whatever data they could regarding the research being conducted there. Simple, right? The engines of the landing transport ship whined as they began their descent. Kira could even feel the wrong vibrations of the world below through the floor, a throb that felt almost alive. She had read the classified reports on the origin of the dimension, or at least the theories. Some fluke of the cosmos had rent a hole between realities, exposing a universe where the physics behaved differently, where consciousness appeared to be a fundamental force that could be manipulated and wielded like a weapon. The things that lived here were more than just predators. They were something worse. They were smart, organized, and as though by some black magic, they understood human psychology. They didn't just kill you. They shattered you first, turned your own mind on you, made you complicit in your own demise. There was a small, strangling sound from Private Chen, and Kira looked over to see him staring at the viewport. eyes wide and horrified. A great shadow had fallen across the ship, something that had been so vast it had monopolized the alien sky for 10 whole seconds. She couldn't see clearly, but she had the impression of wings that spread out for miles, of eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. "Chen, be steady," she said, her voice bearing the tone of someone who had seen worse things and lived to teach others. "Whatever that was, it's not into us now. These things are like sharks. They can sniff out fear, but they also know who is strong. Let them know you're not a pushover and they'll search for easier sources of meat." It was mostly true. Victims that were already broken anyway, already afraid, but Kira had watched them bring to their knees hard-worn veterans who'd been in combat for a decade. The nightmare world was rule-bound, but these were not any rules any human being had ever been taught. There was a grinding jolt as the ship landed, throwing them all forwards. "Not all is lost through the speakers." Captain Rodriguez's voice was strained with tempered panic. "We're down in the hot zone. Readings for the atmosphere are good, but I'm detecting some unusual thermal readings. Your neural dampeners are green, but it's all cased in the reminder that they aren't a 100% guarantee. Watch each other's 6, and keep your comms open." Kira rose and lifted the pack on her shoulder, verifying that her distress beacon was working. The thing was meant to call for evacuation if things went south, but she'd heard tales of soldiers who'd triggered their beacons, only to have something else respond to the call. Some things with human faces, but which swayed with inhuman intent. The transport ship's rear hatch cycled open, and the atmosphere of the nightmare world surged in. There was a thick, oily feeling in the air, coppery and scorched by ozone. Each breath made it feel as if something poisonous was being spread over her lungs, and the neural dampener on her head buzzed more forcefully as it desperately tried to dampen the psychic radiation that hung in the air everywhere. With Kira in the vanguard and Sergeant Wilson bringing up the rear, the squad set off in formation. The area surrounding the landing zone was more alarming still at ground level. What had appeared to be soil from above turned out to be a carpet of a substance that could have been flesh, and pulsated with a slow, constant beat. Their boots printed, the prints filled not behind into stone, but sealed up instantly as though the earth were healing behind them. The research facility was out there in the distance, a mass of prefabricated buildings looking almost absurdly ordinary against their alien setting. But as they drew closer, Kira started to notice details that made her stomach clench. The buildings stood unharmed, but there was no light shining in them, no movement, no trace of the 100-man research team that should have been swarming over the complex. "Perimeter sweep," she commanded, and the team fanned out as they had done so many times before. The stillness was complete except for the wet, breathing sound of the ground on which they trod and for the far howling of something that might have been wind. But Kira tended to trust her instincts, and every instinct was telling her that they were being observed. The entrance to the facility was wide open, and what was leaves hanging on the large gate fluttered in the wind, almost as if something had ripped it open from the other side. Metal was twisted in ways that were painful to consider, shaped into forms that appeared to move and wriggle when they were seen directly. Kira filed away the thought of having the medics do some extra scans later. An extended exposure to the nightmare world's geometry could lead irreparable psychological harm. They entered the gate in a tight cluster of readiness, hands in the air and all. The courtyard outside was deserted, but there were evidences of a struggle. That must have been blood, only it caught the light in ways that blood never did. Brick by brick, Kira murmured over her Chan Morrison, "Get the admin officers. Wilson, Jackson, check the barracks. The rest of you, the big research lab is where we're heading." Starforce was housed in a generical King prefab building, but she could see there was something not right even from the outside. The windows were streaked with what appeared to be scratch marks, long grooves that had been scored into the glass from the inside. The door had been jammed shut as best as it could, a mound of furniture stacked up against it in an insensate, loose surmise at exclusion. Or keep something in. Clive Chen's voice came over the comm, and it was tensed, just barely with restraint, with near terror. "Sergeant, from inside the admin building, no one is here, but indications of a blockade exist. Looks like some folks were trying to keep something from the main office." Anybody is, and she knew the answer already, but she had to ask. "Kira, negative, but the walls are weird. They're covered in writing. It seems someone was trying to say something, but it doesn't add up. It's as though they were writing in code, or their handwriting kind of fizzled as they were writing it." Kira filed that information away. Madness was not unknown in the world of nightmares, but it generally followed some kind of logic. The entities appeared to prey on individual psychological weaknesses, utilizing that fears and anxieties to the point where the test subjects were unable to move in terror. But at other times, the breakdown was more systematic, as if the victims were being reprogrammed, rather than simply going mad. The prototype research lab was one of the larger buildings in the middle of the compound, with sensors and defensive gear adorning its walls, tools that were said to ward off the entities. But as Kira came closer, she saw that a number of sensor arrays had been destroyed, with their components scattered all over the ground like broken toys. Laboratory entrance was secured but unlocked and easily opened. The sound of engines had vanished, and she thought the silence was crushing her eardrums. The emergency lighting bathed everything in a nauseous red glow, and the air was alive with the sour stench of ozone and something else, something fleshy, and just plain wrong. "Spread out," she commanded, but kept her voice down. They police-backed through the laboratory in twos, noting each room in progression. The central research floor was a jumble of instruments and workspaces, but there was no one around to operate them. Computer terminals were still operating, with data streams racing down screens too fast to be read. But several of the screens displayed images that Kira's neural dampener suddenly and acutely noticed. The images were of the entities themselves, and not the blurry, amorphous shapes that often showed up on surveillance tapes. They were high-definition photographs, clear, detailed ones, bringing the creatures into perfect focus, and they were gazing at the camera with faces that were unmistakably intelligent, unmistakably aware of being watched. "Sarge," Morrison's voice crackled over the strained and on the edge of terror. "You need to see this. The barracks, there's stuff in here, but it's not right. It's not what you think." Kira felt her blood run cold. Morrison was a war veteran, a man who'd been in combat in 3 theaters of operation. If he was frightened, he had good cause. "Talk to me, Morrison. What are you seeing?" "The beds. They're occupied. But the people in these tents, they aren't asleep. They're not dead either. They're lying there and looking at the ceiling, and their eyes are moving. Like they're reading something, but there's nothing to read. And when I tried to speak to one of them, he turned his head toward me. He looked at me, and his mouth, it started to move like he was trying to say something, but it made no sound. Sarge, I believe they are still alive, but that there's something wrong with them. Something's very wrong." The medlab for the research facility was located next to the main lab. It was closer than their rooms, and Kira decided to check there next. If the survivors were in some form of catatonic state, medical equipment could provide information on what had happened to them. But as she got to the sick bay, she started hearing something that made her blood run cold, whispering. It was quiet, barely there, but it was there. Several voices, muttering together in a language that was not quite human. The neural dampener on her temple was in overdrive, its hum rising, becoming more insistent, but the whispers sliced through its protection as though it wasn't even there. "Do you hear that?" she asked over the "Hear what?" Chun's voice returned, now bewildered and more fearful. It was then that Kira made her revelation. The whispers were not coming through the air. They were originating from inside her head, wholly bypassing her auditory system. The entities were not simply at the facility. They were in her head, feeling for weaknesses, trying to batter through her defenses. She willed herself to concentrate on the job, to make the voices background noise in her mind. But as she walked further and further into the facility, the voices got louder, more insistent. They were speaking English, she realized now, and using words she knew, put together, in a sequence that made no sense. "Darkness, dreams of light," another voice said. One of my favorite lines of his, I believe it's from the God of Small Things, which I think is a little overrated. Contrary to what most people say, is the body remembers what the mind forgets. "Keep the chatter down," she muttered, to herself as much as the team. "We need to move faster. There's something wrong with this place other than what we thought." It was controlled chaos in the medical bay. Equipment was strewn on the floor, and some of the examination tables had been knocked over, but there was no indication of any violence, no blood or debris that would have suggested an altercation. It was as though everyone had gone, leaving tools of trade behind. But on one of the undamaged examination tables, Kira spotted something so chilling it made her blood run cold. A journal scrawled throughout with the same handwritten text, a script that grew more frenzied the further the reader read. The first entries were clinical in nature, discussing experimentations with captured entities and their impact on human subjects, but as she read on, the tone shifted, becoming more personal, more desperate. Day 47. Our test subjects are beginning to respond to neural interface testing, but not as we had hoped. This link is working in reverse, not allowing us to control these entities, but appear to be able to utilize them. The entities are coming through human consciousness. They are learning how we feel, learning how we think, Dr. Hartwell insisted. We press forward with the experiments, but I'm not so sure. Day 52. 3 additional researchers have offered to be tested on the interface. I attempted to dissuade them, but they claimed hitting it off with the entities was out of this world. It gave them insight into the fundamental nature of what really was. Afterward, when I looked at their brain activity, it displayed patterns I have never seen. It's like something they're imagining with half a mind. Day 58. The volunteers are no longer responding to stimuli. They are lying in their beds, looking at nothing, but their neural activity is through the roof. It's almost like they're having an incredible experience, one that renders the physical world irrelevant. Hartwell ordered me to continue creating further subjects. I can't help but feel that we are no longer experimenting on the entities. They're studying us. The last was in a script so difficult to read, the letters seemed to writhe and move on the page. Day 60. They're beautiful. I know why the others quit fighting. They're not out to get us. They are attempting to rescue us from the jailhouse of our own awareness. The material world is the tip of an iceberg of what's out there. I can see it now. The reality that is real beyond the veil. I'm going to join them. I'm going to let them reveal what I truly am. Kira let the journal fall and took a step back, her hand on her weapon, but as she did, she realized that the whispering in her head had ceased. The medical bay was quiet but for the machine's humming, and the muffled din of her squad stalking through the base. Too silent. Squad, report. She called into her come, but heard nothing back. The radio sputtered static, and beneath the white noise, she heard something that could have been voices if they hadn't been so warped. She flew through the building, searching every room she had placed her troops in. The administration building was deserted, no sight of Chen or Morrison. The bunks were empty as well. The beds Morrison had said were occupied now, nothing more than rumpled sheets and the faint impressions of warm humanity. But she found them. In the main laboratory, all of her squad members, who were all positioned in a perfect ring around some unknown piece of equipment, that is, they were still gazing at the machine with faces of that perfect, terrible piece. Their eyes were open, but they were not looking at the world around them. They were seeing something else, something that transcended the limits of everyday reality. Chen, she called, but he didn't answer. She went up to him cautiously, but his breathing was regular and his pulse natural. But when she shook her hand in front of his face, he didn't respond. It was as if he was seeing through her, past her, into something that only he could see, that there was nothing in the mission briefings like the one at the center of the circle. It was more or less spherical, a little bigger than a basketball, but its surface seemed to ripple like and flow like quicksilver. Light patterns raced across it, and Kira saw that they were not random. They were writing symbols that shifted as if on their own as she watched. And the more she looked at the gear, the more she realized what had happened to her squad, what happened to the team, what had happened to every person that came into contact with that thing. The device was more than a tool. It was a portal to a far realm, a place of pure consciousness where the beings dwelled. The scientists hadn't been killed or taken prisoner. The door had been opened to them, and they allowed them to come through the door and experience to a limited extent the reality of the entities. And having witnessed what was beyond the veil of the physical world, they had absolutely no desire to go back to their cramped-up human forms. But even knowing the truth didn't make her any less desperate. Her team was gone, stuck wherever that alternate dimension the device opened led them. The lab was a total loss, likely unrecoverable. There was nothing and no one there with her. In a place where any of the shadows could be something that wished to eat not only her flesh, but her soul, the whispers resumed. Still faint, but more distinct. She could hear voices, and there were those she knew were on her squad. Kira Chen's voice was everywhere at once and nowhere. You don't have to fight any longer. You don't have to be afraid. We've discovered the most amazing thing, something that makes all of the pain and fear of the physical world completely meaningless. Just touch the device. Just let yourself see what we see. It's so pretty here, Morrison continued, the wonder in his voice more frightening than any scream. There's no war, no death, no suffering, just pure existence, pure consciousness. You can join us, Kira, you can be free. But Kira was a soldier of too many years not to hear that come on of peace. She had learned that freedom from an enemy was just another kind of bondage. The entities weren't offering salvation, they were offering surrender. She stumbled backwards. From the machine, her gun pointed at the orb, though she knew bullets would likely do nothing to it. But as she shifted, she discovered that the device was shifting with her, or more accurately, her perspective of it was shifting. No matter where she turned since then, she had felt the sphere always taking the epicenter of her vision, drawing her in with a sense of magnetic forces of its hypnotic patterns. "You can't resist us forever," another voice spoke next. It was Dr. Hartwell, the head scientist. "We know you now, Kira Blackwood. We know your fears and regrets and deepest desires. We have heard about the civilians you were unable to rescue in Syria, about the nightmares that wake you up with screaming. We can erase all that pain. We can make you forget." The word Syria landed on her like a punch. The mission she had messed up on, the village that had burned down while she was helplessly perched in a sniper's nest, 2 miles distant, the faces of the children she'd failed to save, the crushing weight of loss that had led her to volunteer for progressively more dangerous missions. But that pain, that guilt, that was her human. It was what separated her from the things that whispered in the night, offering simple answers to complicated puzzles. The entities offered peacefulness, but it was the peace of the grave, a quiet mind stilled in its struggle to express itself. "No," she responded to no one in particular, her voice bouncing off empty laboratory walls. "I won't let you take them. I won't let you take me." The device shivered with angry light, and all at once, the air about her was alive with forms that danced just beyond the reach of her gaze. They were no longer in hiding, no longer playing at being friendly. They were revealing their true selves. Beings of sheer malevolence which fed on the human mind like parasites. Kira fired her pulse rifle, spluttering coherent energy at the dancing shadows. A number of her shots appeared to land, and the entities recoiled with what sounded like the backwards echoes of a scream. But for every one she struck, 2 more appeared to take its place, and she realized that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win conventionally. The generators still hummed, and Kira recalled from the mission briefing that the research team had been using high-energy electromagnetic fields as a means to interfere with the entity's capacity to enter the material realm. If she could cause the power grid of the facility to overload, she might send a feedback pulse that would damage the device and release her squad, but that would take him further into the facility, into the regions where the things were most powerful, and it would leave her squad behind, trusting that they'd be able to withstand whatever she was about to unleash. The control room was in the basement of the main lab, to which Winston climbed down a stairwell into darkness. The further Kira descended, the more explicit and insistent the whispers became. The things were attempting to penetrate her neural dampener, battering at its walls with raw weight of psycho attack. "You'll kill them," taunted Dr. Hartwell, ruining her serene moment. "Your little team, the scholars, anyone who comes to our world to escape and find peace. You are going to ruin them all because you can't admit that you are wrong." "Perhaps," replied Kira, her voice strong even as she could feel herself shaking from the inside. "But I'd rather die fighting than live as a slave." The power control room was a myriad of conduits and control panels. Yet Kira had memorized the facility layout during the briefing on the mission. She knew which systems regulated the electromagnetic field generators, and she knew how to cause them to fry. But as she started to work, she found that she was not alone in the room. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing in the corner, and who could have been human once. It was tall and thin, with skin that appeared to eat in light, rather than reflect it. Its eyes were not simply holes in its face, openings with nothing behind them, but holes with nothing behind them that were filled with the endless night sky. "You cannot destroy us," the entity said, voiced the whistling of wind across a cemetery. "We are eternal. We are inevitable. Your kind will die, just as many others have. This is not conquest. This is evolution." The complex fingers danced along all the controls, and Kira just laughed. "Evolution is all about improvement. What you're offering is extinction." The presence came closer, and Kira felt a chill wave through the room. Her neural dampener was shrieking alerts, its circuits overwhelmed by the psi-force emanating from the thing, but she continued working, button pressing and setting, jiggling, building to the point when she might just overload the entire system. "Death you fear," the being whispered, "but death is simply one more limitation right there on your physical level. In our world, consciousness lasts forever. You might even live forever. See wonders you never knew existed out there. All you have to do is not fight." "I've been fighting since the day I was born," Kira said, her hand just above the last dial. "I'm not going to stop now." With a click of the button, the power grid of the building was engulfed with an electrical cascade that exploded from the building. The lights went fluttering out, and the crackling hum of overloaded circuits took their place. The electromagnetic field generator wind, drawing power above its safe operating threshold, and beyond her, somewhere upward, Kira could hear the machine emit a sound that matched the device to frequencies that had no right to be. The thing in the corner made a noise that was half scream, half laugh, half something that had no name in any human tongue. Its shape started to warp, becoming even more abstract, more impossible to deign to look at. But it didn't disappear. Only it seemed to expand rather than fade, to become more tangible and solid, as if the surging power grid were feeding it rather than destroying it. "Thus you've given us power," it said, its voice now echoing through the facility's intercom. "System, you have opened a Pandora's box, and your world will be like ours, and your people will thank you for the gift of immortal servitude." But Kira was already in motion, sprinting up the stairs to the main laboratory. She had one last trick up her sleeve, a risky Hail Mary that might yet save her squad and stop the entities from using the facility as a launching point for a full-scale invasion of Earth. The extraction beacon. She had been saving it for emergencies, and this certainly qualified as an ultimate emergency. The beacon would be for an evac, and we'd all get a squared 2 full military response dropped on us. But it would also be sending human reinforcements into a hotbed, potentially making them vulnerable to the fate that had befallen her squad. She could figure out how to contain the threat, anyway. The big lab was chaos now. The object in the middle of the structure was whirling wildly, scintillating with patterns of light too painful to examine. Her squadmates, still stationed firmly in their circle, were swaying on their feet in time to a rhythm that had the device as a source, and there were more coming. The beings were coming out in force. More sinister now, they were no longer attempting to conceal what they were, shifting as masses of shadow and malice that poisoned the air with the smell of rot, sounding like whispered languages before humanity came to be. Kira turned on her extraction beacon. It didn't signal for extraction. It was a code for the self-destruct sequence for the facility. Each of the military research centers in the bad future had a nuclear failsafe to stop the technology from being captured by the enemy. She was betting that the EMP from a nuke would be enough to interfere with the thing and close whatever door the entities had ajar, but she was also rolling dice with the lives of her squad, on the chance that she was wrong about the true natures of these entities, with the slim possibility that she was about to commit mass murder merely because she refused to give up. The countdown started, and Kira had 5 minutes left to evacuate, or save her squad. She reached out for Chen, a bid to revive him from the trance, but he was as stiff as a mannequin. Her touch had no effect whatsoever. His eyes were open, and he was seeing something that was not in the physical world. And when she looked into his eyes, she saw things best described as impossible geometries and colors that had no names. For minutes, she attempted the others, but they were all alike, trapped in some realm the things that filed them had given them, lost to wherever that realm had been, their minds enmeshed in a web of glamours and betrayals. The apparatus still spun, increasingly bright the longer it churned. 3 minutes. The thing's orgasms, were they orgasms, seemed to become more aggressive, pushing nearer to her perch. She could sense their hatred now, their fury at having been stopped within reach of success. They had gotten this close not just to taking the research facility, but to the entire squad of human soldiers which would have been used as guinea pigs for their invasion tactics. 2 minutes. Kira made her choice. He was unable to save her regiment, unable to bring them back from whatever time stream they had enticed into. But she at least was able to stop the entities from using them as weapons against Earth. She could ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. 1 minute she was standing in the middle of the lab, surrounded by her lost soldiers and the alien things responsible. The device was spinning crazily now, so much so that it began to look as though it was a solid ball of light, and the air that surrounded it had started to dither and warp, as if the very structure reality itself was being twisted in on itself. 30 seconds. Yes, screaming, the sound of their voices mingling with the hum of the device and the imminent nuclear blast. They knew what was coming, and they were trying to flee back to their own dimension, but the mechanism was jammed in place, and the surge of power prevented them from shutting the door they had opened. 10 seconds. Kira closed her eyes and remembered Syria, the civilians she was unable to save, the guilt that led her to volunteer for this mission. She thought of her squad, of the young soldiers who had trusted in her to bring them home safely. She thought of Earth, of the dirty, polluting planet, about all those billions of people who would never know that she'd died, protecting their world. 5 seconds. The nuclear device went off in a bright light that could be seen from orbit. The research base disappeared into a globe of superheated plasma, and the pulse that followed sent ripples through the dimensional wall like a stone cast into a still pond. Their cries were silenced as the portal crumbled, their connections to the physical world severed, leaving them trapped in their own twisted domain of darkness and terror. But as she waited for the explosion to engulf everything, Kira felt something she hadn't anticipated. Peace. Not the false peace offered by the entities, but true peace, the peace of knowing you did the right thing. That you fought the good fight, that your sacrifice meant something. She had been a soldier from birth, and she died as a soldier should die, protecting others, fighting the enemy, not giving up no matter how certain defeat. The nightmare world had tested her, had revealed her fears, her weaknesses, had given her everything she charmed for. But in the end, she had decided to stay human. To embrace the hurt and the imperfection of mortality instead of the empty perfection of the entities. Sphere. From the orbital observation station, the explosion had been visible, a transient star that had burned against the alien sky of the nightmare planet. The research center was no more, transformed into radioactive dust and twisted metal. The dimensional door was shut, the entity's plans for invasion ended, but the cost had been high. 12 soldiers and 100 scientists were dead to discover the truth about this nightmare world, and the creatures that called it home. In the weeks to come, all activity in Dimension X7 was halted by the military. The official report would describe the incident as a failure in containment, caused by a lack of safety features, and little knowledge on the capabilities of the beings. But those who read between the lines knew the truth. The nightmare world was not a realm that could be conquered or even surveyed. It was a place of pure malevolence in which consciousness itself had been weaponized, and where the very act of attention was inherently a form of surrender. Staff Sergeant Kira Blackwood was awarded the Medal of Honor for her actions that had likely averted massive systemic incursion. Her death had saved not only Earth, but possibly hundreds, thousands, who knows how many worlds, that might have been held under the sway of the entities. The citation was brief, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty, but maybe the most apt memorialization was the permanent sealing of the dimensional gateway to 10-7. The realm of nightmares would forever yawn just beyond the grasp of humanity, its shadows and whispers confined to their own dark corner of existence. The entities would need to search for other prey, other victims to drain of consciousness and feed with suffering, and out there, where the barriers between dimensions were weak and reality was unstable, other races would come to fear the darkness that walked among the stars. They would build their own neural dampeners, devise their own procedures for handling entities that lived outside of physical law. They would tell stories of worlds fallen to the whispers in the dark, of civilizations that turned upon themselves and unraveled themselves in their own questions about consciousness and reality. But Earth would endure. The human race would march ever forward, into the unknown, into everything else that science could possibly unlock for them. But they would do so with the understanding that there are certain doors that should stay shut, certain questions that should never be put. The nightmare world had instructed them that consciousness was not only something to utilize, but it could be turned against its owner as a weapon, and out there, somewhere in the tangled web of military systems, in the classified reports that would never be read, Kira Blackwood's last transmission lived on. Just one tentative stroke for humanity's first and final meeting with the creatures of the nightmare realm. Some battles can't be won by fighting on your opponent's terms. Everything was as it had been, from the eerie landscapes to the malevolent beings who haunted them. Not shine, stood silent and still, forever lost in a dark cavalcade of shadows and whispers. But the gate had been shut, the bridge between dimensions was broken, and in the quiet that followed, the universe itself let out a sigh of relief. The war ended before it even really began. The ultimate test was challenging everything that a human being would do to try to protect its own life, and in the form of one defiant soldier who chose death over surrender, who had chosen to die rather than accept the false salvation these beings, these creatures who fed on fear and despair, offered as a solution to their problems. They had shown them that consciousness wasn't just a means to an end, but a power to be reckoned with. The nightmare world would need to hunt other victims, but it would never forget the taste of human defiance, the bitter taste of a species that would sooner die than yield. And deep within its dark domain, the creatures would murmur fresh warnings to their kin, warning them of the tiny blue world, where creatures had discovered how to resist the dark and fight back against it, where any shadow could conceal a soldier like Kira Blackwood, prepared to give every last breath to keep the light.